Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to open this amazing session with so many distinguished speakers and one most distinguished speaker. My name is Adéla Gjuričová. I'm the director of the Institute of Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Sciences, and I'm very happy to be able to have you all here, so many lovely guests at the auspices of the Czech Academy of Sciences here at Národní třída. I will first introduce the speakers for today. You all came to see Professor Jürgen Kocka, and there'll be an introduction later on, so I will skip that one. Then we have His Excellency Ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, Mr. Andreas Künne, and Martin Schulze Wessel, professor at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, director of the Collegium Carolinum. I'll pass the word on to His Excellency Ambassador now, who said he would not have an opening word, but 2 or 3 because he couldn't resist. Let's see.
Thank you very much to the organizers for hosting this event. Thank you very much, Professor Kocka, for being in Prague with us. I said it would be more than a word because I just couldn't resist. The combination of Professor Kocka and the topic he'll be discussing just provoked me into wanting to say a few more words. Professor Kocka, maybe in the first place, some of you might know I'm a trained historian. Before I became a diplomat, I was a historian, and Professor Kocka was together with 2 or 3 Frenchmen, responsible for drawing me into social history and responsible for me being more interested in the longue durée and more interested in seminal developments than in battles or kings or princes or princesses or whatever, but more in the developments that take a bit more of time. And he was an inspiration for a whole generation of young historians in the 80s and in the 90s, and I'm sure he still is an inspiration. When I see the size of the audience, he still is an inspiration today. Dealing with a difficult past is the subtitle of today's lecture, and that's something which is ingrained into almost every German of my generation, and I guess it's needless to say it's part and parcel of a German ambassador's job description practically everywhere, and particularly so in Czechia. There might be some of you who follow the embassy's activities, and you would have noticed that my team and I dedicate a lot of attention and effort into organizing commemorative events. We participate in a rather large number of events dealing with the Shoah, with the bloody repression of the Czech resistance and the crimes committed by my forefathers in the Bohemian and Moravian lands. Just a few weeks ago, for example, we organized jointly with the French and Polish colleagues and my Israeli colleague a commemorative event in Česká Lípa, commemorating a death march there that went from the KZ in Schwarzheide to Terezin. That was just one event of a whole series of events that we're organizing now, also in connection with the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. The next one will come up next Tuesday, where we have a concert for survivors of the Shoah at the embassy. Even though you're historians who might wonder why we put such an effort into this, put simply, the answer would of course be that reconciliation can only be possible when the deep wounds caused by history are healing. After the end of the communist regime, Czech-German reconciliation took longer and was more difficult than it was with most of our other neighbors. In hindsight, this rather difficult path that we followed proved to be the right path. And the first and primordial step really was compensation, financial compensation only, of course, of the victims, the Czech victims of Nazi persecution. For that, the Czech-German Future Fund was installed in the first place. And only when that had begun could we begin to openly discuss our joint past. In the 90s, it was Czech survivors of the Shoah like Felix Kolmar or Andrej Stransky who stressed the importance of compensation and who at the same time were ready to reach out also for reconciliation. And this, combined with an unequivocal acknowledgement of German responsibility, helped pave the way. And it turned out that in the years after 1997, when the declaration, the German-Czech declaration was signed, and after 1998, when the Czech-German Future Fund came into existence, in those years following these two events, milestones, it was the Jewish community who were our most important partners and our most important supporters also in discussing the thorny issues that we still had in our bilateral relations, including the forced expulsion of the German-speaking population in 1945 and 46. And to this day, the Jewish community continues to be of crucial importance to our relations. There are countless, as you know, events remembering the victims of Nazi persecution in Czech cities, towns, villages. And I think that it's pretty obvious that who, if not us, can thank the organizers for safeguarding these memories and for passing them on to the next generation. Only when we recognize the suffering and remember the victims can we achieve true reconciliation. We cannot expect this to happen without us taking the first step, without us listening. When we participate in these events, we can also take them as an indicator of how far our relations have progressed. People are truly grateful for us being present. And years ago, when we had organized the first meeting with the Terezin Initiative, the initiative of the survivors of Terezin at the embassy, we basically invited them for coffee. We had no idea how many people would attend, and we were a bit afraid. In the end, it turned out that it was many more people who attended than even the chairperson of the initiative had expected. For many survivors, and we can still see that, it is something very special to be invited to the German embassy because it serves as proof that we recognize their sacrifices and their suffering. So, as an ambassador, I'm obviously responsible for the political relations, for the commercial relations, and you all know that we don't cease to say German-Czech relations are the best we ever had. And I'm deeply convinced that this is due to a very large part to our work in jointly commemorating the events of the 20th century. We managed to build a basis of real trust between Czechs and Germans, and I think we have jointly come a long way. We aren't there yet, but we've come a very long way. And trust, of course, is one of the most valuable commodities in international relations. Europe couldn't exist without it. This trust is under attack. Today, 80 years after the end of the Second World War, we witness a shocking increase of nationalist, anti-democratic tendencies and the strengthening of the political fringes. Things that would have deemed to be lunatic 10 to 15 years ago are now part of the ordinary mainstream political discourse almost. We see war in Europe again, where Ukraine has been suffering for more than 3 years now from a brutal large-scale Russian aggression. Faced with war and a new kind of authoritarianism threatening us from both the outside and the inside, the phrase "never again" that was coined 80 years ago by the liberated prisoners of Buchenwald might begin to sound a bit hollow in our ears. And maybe never again is just a wish. And it's a wish that will not be fulfilled, as we see, because we see war again, and we see a movement back into the opposite direction of where we would have wanted to see our continent move. What we can achieve is, in Germany we would say, so nie wieder, never again this way. That we can achieve, I think. There we have gone a long way. But in order to come to a place where we can say, we have done everything possible in order to make a repetition as impossible as we can, I think it is more important than ever to continue to work on that what in German is called Erinnerungskultur, hard to translate. the culture of remembrance, not just to look back, not just as an act of remembrance and homage to the victims, but also of a reminder of what can and inevitably will happen when undemocratic parties take power, when they demand the marginalization of large sections of the population. Today it's migrants, and who knows who it's going to be tomorrow. And at the same time, obviously, our commemorative events, museums, and education programs must not be limited to the past. And when we look at where we've come in Europe, and I obviously refer to the Czech-German example in the first place, I think we can see that even the deepest drifts, things that we had imagined to be uncrossable, that even the deepest drifts can be bridged. And I think this also gives ground for optimism. And what we've achieved in the European Union, where we haven't had a war among the nations of the European Union for 80 years, is something that we haven't seen ever before in the history of our continent. And I'm convinced that this can be achieved elsewhere as well. Now, concluding, let me briefly come back to the rise of authoritarian parties in Germany. We're seeing the fourth generation after the end of the Second World War grow up in Germany. We see a generation grow up in Germany where the proportion of ethnic Germans is decreasing. So is it really time to change this culture of remembrance, as many people suggest? Are we truly fixated upon history? And it is an Iranian-German writer and also a Peace Prize winner, Navid Kermani, who, from my perspective, gave the most convincing and clear answer. After he had visited Auschwitz, he said that anyone who becomes a German citizen must also bear the burden of being German. In his opinion, today's Stolpersteine commemorative rituals are no longer enough for future generations. In view of the fact that the survivors and witnesses will soon no longer be with us, visiting concentration camps and similar places will become increasingly important. As a German, you will never be a mere visitor to Auschwitz, says Kerman. So, is this the answer to the question of how to deal with a difficult past? Who better to answer this question than you, Professor Kocka? And I'm very much looking forward to your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for such a sophisticated 2 words expressing support to this joint event organized by the Institute of Contemporary History in Prague, Collegium Carolinum in Munich, and also the Prague branch of Collegium Carolinum. And then I should also mention the Prague branch of GWZO and the Prague branch of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw as co-organizers. Martin Schulze-Wessel will introduce Professor Kocka now.
Dear Adéla Gjuričová, dear Ambassador, dear Jürgen Kocka, dear colleagues, I'm so happy to see many colleagues from the Academy of Science and Charles University here. And it's a great pleasure to see so many students in this room. It's my great pleasure to briefly introduce Jürgen Kocka to you. I'm doing this also on behalf of Adéla Gjuričová. And we both are pleased to have one of Germany's leading historians as our speaker today. Jürgen Kocka was born in Heindorf, Heinitze, in northern Bohemia in 1941. After being expelled, he grew up in Essen in Western Germany and later studied history, political science, sociology, and philosophy in Marburg, Vienna, Berlin, and Chapel Hill. In 1968, he received his doctorate from the Freie Universität in Berlin under Gerhard A. Ritter with a historical study on the emergence of industrial bureaucracy and white-collar workers at Siemens. Further positions took him to Münster and Harvard University until he was appointed to the University of Bielefeld in 1972. Kocka became one of the leaders of what was called the Bielefeld School of the New Social History, which became a central concept of historiographic revisionism, which was directed against the widespread view that great men make history. The Bielefeld School gave priority to structures and processes over actors and events. It was close to the social sciences rather than to traditional methods of historical hermeneutics. Jürgen Kocka himself did research on the working class and later on the bourgeois society. He also contributed to the endeavor of Begriffsgeschichte, the conceptual history, by an article on white-collar workers, which based this conceptual history in social history. Jürgen Kocka's research during this period was devoted to German and American history. An important question concerned the history of Germany in comparison with Western nations. Was there a German Sonderweg, a special path? And he intervened in many public discussions. I should mention here, for example, in the Deutschen Historikerstreit, which was not only a discussion between historians, but between historians and politicians. And I just on the way in the Flixbus to Prague, I read one of your contributions in which you quoted Alfred Traeger, one of the leading politicians in the 1970s, 80s, in the Conservative Party, the CDU. And Alfred Traeger said things which today would be outside the democratic spectrum. He mentioned, I quote this in German and translate it afterwards, wer die sogenannte Vergangenheitsbewältigung, die gewiss notwendig war, missbraucht, um unser Volk zukunftsunfähig zu machen, muss auf unseren Widerstand rechnen, muss auf unseren Widerstand stoßen. That is, those who misuse the so-called mastery of the past in order to render our people incapable of mastering the future must be rejected. And Jürgen Kocka rejected this speech by saying, I would argue, I quote now Jürgen Kocka, that clear and lively recollection of most disastrous period of our German history does not paralyze us as political society. It may well be the opposite. In 1988, he was appointed to the Freie Universität Berlin. There he developed the method of historical comparison and advanced the comparative method in research programs. Later, Jürgen Kocka raised awareness of the entangled history approach. His interests now extended far beyond German history and American history to include European and global history. Jürgen Kocka founded the Center for Social Comparison, Zentrum für Gesellschaftsvergleich, and in 1998, the Center for Comparative History in Europe, which brought together fellows from all over Europe and which was a truly inspiring place for the humanities and social sciences, in which many colleagues who are in this room now had the privilege to participate, I myself belonging to them. Central European history played a significant role in the research program of the center. Jürgen Kocka held many positions that I cannot list in full. I will mention only just two. From 1995 to 2000, he was member of the Executive Committee of the International Committee of Social Sciences, the CISH. And from 2001 to 2007, he was president of the Berlin Social Science Center, the WZB. For his scientific achievements, Jürgen Kocka has been awarded numerous prizes and honors, and allow me just to mention a few. Jürgen Kocka was awarded the Leibniz Prize. He received honorary doctorates from faculties at Uppsala, Rotterdam, Moscow, and Florence universities. And in 2011, he was awarded the Holberg International Memorial Prize. And this is a very short selection. So I'm very happy that you accepted our invitation, and we are very much looking forward to your speech.
So, good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to come here and talk about this topic, and many thanks to the introductions we just heard, which are very friendly introductions, and I hope I will not disappoint you when I talk about the subject matter of today. Memory, conflict, and research, dealing with a difficult past. In 1648, the 30 Years' War that had devastated large parts of Europe was brought to an end by the Peace of Westphalia. The peace treaty stated, I quote, "There shall be eternal oblivion and amnesty on both sides for all that has been committed as hostile acts in whatever place and in whatever manner by one side or the other in both directions. Everything shall be buried in eternal oblivion." Vergessenheit. And this was no exception. From antiquity to modern times, after wars, civil wars, revolutions, it was fairly regularly resolved and stated to forget or conceal the bad things that had happened, violence, offenses, injustices, for the sake of future peace. The documents agreed upon by the victors of World War II contained the opposite message. They demanded that war crimes and the guilt of the losers be dealt with publicly, including through legal means, with the goal of punishment, atonement, and remembrance. It's now the norm, not always realized, the norm to publicly commemorate even and especially the most terrible past, in the interest of the victims and their recognition, in the name of justice, or with the goal of learning from memory and thereby shaping a better future. This significant change is linked to long-term democratization in modern times, I believe, to the increasingly massive involvement of broad sections of the population in major politics, and probably also to increasing moralization when it comes to fundamental questions such as war, peace, and justice. My lecture today is about dealing with the terrible past, especially in the form of memory. I will focus on two major themes. First, on our German relationship to the history of National Socialist dictatorships and its crimes, that means to Germans as perpetrators. And second, our relationship to Germans as victims, especially the victims of flight and expulsion in the 1940s. We will be talking about the changes in how we have dealt with these two historical legacies over the past decades up to the present day. It becomes clear that a distinction must be made between the period up to 1989-90 and the decades since. The restitution of the German nation-state, reunification, has changed our thinking, memory, and research in this field, like in many other fields. A complicated, painful, and controversial picture emerges when one considers how Germans dealt with the burden of their National Socialist past between the end of the war and reunification. The deep defeat at the end of World War II, the power of the victors who occupied the defeated country in four zones, and also some disappointment with and criticism of the Nazi years led both West Germans and East Germans, both the emerging Federal Republic of Germany and the emerging GDR, German Democratic Republic, to decisively and critically distance themselves from the Nazi dictatorship. But in the GDR, this was done under the banner of a doctrine of Marxist-Leninist anti-fascism, which had some problematic aspects. From this perspective, National Socialism was understood as a matter of the elites, as a matter of the bourgeoisie, feudal and military elites, by whom the people, by whom the mass of ordinary citizens had been seduced, misled, and instrumentalized. Ultimately, capitalism and its crisis were blamed for it, thus placing the responsibility on actors and structures that the GDR, depicting itself as a socialist state of workers and peasants, claimed to have overcome. This way, National Socialism ultimately appeared as something external, foreign, alien, for which the Germans in the new GDR were not truly responsible. A very one-sided but conveniently exculpatory image. It was different in the Federal Republic of Germany, where the actual separation from the National Socialist system was a laborious, slow, and interrupted process. There were many personnel and mental continuities, at least in society and economy, whereas politics under Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, supported by his Western orientation and strongly influenced by the Western occupation forces in the beginning Cold War, had already been positioned in a strict rejection of National Socialism in favor of a constitutional polity on the basis of the basic law, the Constitution of 1948. Painstaking, accurate historical research has shown in the meantime that large numbers of ex-Nazis, also from leading positions, filled positions and influenced decisions within corporations, schools, universities, research institutes, etc. But also in courts and in ministries. One wonders, actually, looking back, why in spite of these heavy continuities, the Federal Republic successfully developed in the direction of a constitutional, increasingly liberal and democratic system. And there has been an interesting debate about how functional the silence was, which was accepted with respect to many individual commitments to National Socialism before. The philosopher Lübbe has been an important person in this debate. Undoubtedly, these continuities were related to the very hesitant progress made in coming to terms with the dark past of the Federal Republic in the 1950s. Now, admittedly, the 1950s were by no means as lean, bleiern, and restorative as is often claimed. Self-critical voices were heard from inside the churches. Important literature appeared, such as Heinrich Böll's Where Were You, Adam? Or Günter Grass, The Tin Drum, books that dealt with problems of guilt and responsibility. But in general, much consideration was shown by many persons, by many practitioners for one another. And much was concealed and repressed, both in public discourse and in private within the families. Historical research into the Nazi era started early. The Institute for Contemporary History in Munich was founded in 1949 with the explicit mission to study the National Socialist dictatorship. But in general, other problems were more important than what was then called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. In the 1960s, with their critique of tradition, their willingness to protest, with their reformist policies, critical perspectives gained ground. The major, highly publicized trials in Jerusalem against Eichmann in 1961 and in Frankfurt against the leading personnel of the concentration camp Auschwitz, 1963 to 65, shook up the public. Among the growing criticism of the political establishment by intellectuals, students, assistants, and within the protest of young people against the older generations was the accusation that they had not openly enough and not honestly enough accounted for their involvement in the National Socialist system. This was one of the central themes of 1968, of the movement in universities, revealing dramatically Nazi involvement in the biography of then functioning professors. At the same time, substantive debates took place in the federal parliament on the question of the statute of limitations, Verjährung, for Nazi crimes. And all this and other things signaled the arrival of a new, more critical generation in public life. But the atrocities committed during the National Socialist era were more exposed and unmasked than remembered and mourned. Critics attacked, but rarely did they use the term "we" when speaking about Nazi crimes. The situation changed again in the 1970s and 80s. There was a general tendency then to appropriate the past as a contribution to one's own individual or collective identity formation, rather than merely understanding it in order to learn from it. Terms such as memory, Erinnerung, experience, Erfahrung, concern, Betroffenheit, and collective memory, kollektives Gedächtnis, now gained currency. And interest in history became more multidimensional, more concrete, and at times more emotional. Historical exhibitions were held. The visual dimensions of history received more attention, and everyday history, Alltagsgeschichte, became attractive. These were changes of our relation to the past and of historical studies in general, but they also impacted, changed, and increased interest in the history of National Socialism, its victims, and its perpetrators. In 1979, the American TV series Holocaust was broadcast in West Germany with considerable publicity. In the mid-1980s, the so-called historians' dispute, Historikerstreit, was played out in the mainstream media. Actually, more journalists were active than historians, but many historians too. At issue was the place of the Holocaust in German and European history. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the 8th of May of the end of, in 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the unconditional surrender of the German army, then Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker delivered a remarkable speech in which he clearly outlined the history of sufferings and crimes experienced during the Nazi era. He emphasized German responsibility for them. In contrast to previous high-level addresses of this kind, Weizsäcker famously characterized May 8, 1945, primarily as a day of liberation, Befreiung. He was able to find language that combined grief and recognition of German guilt, but also dignity and confidence in the future. His speech was not anonymously, not by everybody accepted. Others held that the 8th May of 1945 was not only a day of Befreiung, of liberation, but also of a defeat and loss. And this debate has been going on in Germany in different ways until today. In the final years of the Federal Republic, the relatively honest and open remembrance of the Nazi era had become a central component of German public identity. As painful as this acceptance of German guilt and responsibility was, it contributed greatly to the consolidation of democracy in Germany, for it simultaneously acted as an incentive to work for the Federal Republic as a better Germany, which would overcome this past. You must know this past in order to overcome it. Generational change had facilitated this, of course. Many of those who had been directly involved had left their offices or died. Historical research had made an important contribution to all this, and history teaching in schools even more so, thanks to the commitment of countless teachers. So, in this slowly emerging picture of a highly burdensome period of our past, and in this recognition as a history for which we are responsible, there were blind spots, or at least semi-blind spots. Among these, I include the history of the Germans as victims. Right now, I do not refer to the numerous Germans who were persecuted, dispossessed, expelled, and murdered by the Nazi regime for racist, political, or other reasons. Rather, I have in mind the civilian population who suffered from Allied bombing raids on German cities, from flight and expulsion, from the arbitrary actions of the occupiers, and suffered as prisoners of war before and after 1945. Critical commentators in the early 1990s described the topic of flight and expulsion, Flucht und Vertreibung, in particular as a repressed topic. For example, Johann Georg Reismüller, born in Litomerice, Leitmeritz, and co-editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, criticized that few German politicians were willing to call for commemoration of the expellees. And he demanded that the countless Germans who died at the hands of mass murder at the end of the war and afterward also have a place in the nation's memory, as he formulated. Presumably, in reference to the fact that the approximately 12 million Germans, ethnic Germans, who fled and were expelled from Eastern, Central and Southeastern Europe since 1944, an estimated 2.5 million perished on their way west. As late as 1999, the renowned literary scholar Aleida Assmann described flight and expulsion as a traumatic place that continues to resist affirmative meaning-making, affirmative Sinnbildung. Not that there had been a complete lack of historical research on the topic of flight and expulsion between the late 1940s and the late 1980s. The 8-volume documentation of the expulsion of Germans from East Central Europe was edited by the historian Theodor Schieder and published between 1951 and 1961, heavily subsidized by the Federal Ministry for Expellees and Refugees, which existed between 1949 and 1969. And organizations of refugees and expellees continually demanded greater attention and recognition for what they called the lost homeland in the German East and for the victims of flight and expulsion. In the 1950s and 1960s, numerous government measures, laws, regulations, subsidies, symbolic acts were implemented with the aim of clarifying the status of refugees and with the aim of providing some compensation to those affected. Relevant remembrance work was also undertaken at the local level. It is estimated that 400 to 500 memorials and monuments, mostly in the form of tall stone crosses dedicated to, quote, the dead of the homeland, were erected in the 1950s and 60s at very different places. In the 60s and 70s, widely read novels and memoirs appeared, in which authors such as Peter Hertling, Johannes Bobrowski, Günter Grass, Horst Bienek, Siegfried Lenz, Johannes Urzidil recounted life in various East Central European regions, including Bohemia and Moravia. They addressed the topic of flight and expulsion and the associated suffering in literary forms, often sensitively and thoughtfully, and usually without the political demands and claims that were rarely absent from the relevant statements of expellee functionaries and politicians. But in the public discourse on commemoration, on remembrance, the topics flight and expulsion became politically controversial and somewhat marginal since the late 1960s, when the political mood changed towards a closer cooperation with Germany's eastern neighbors, including Poland and Czechoslovakia, under the chancellors Willy Brandt and Helmut Schmidt, and this changed only very slowly under Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who started to govern in 1982. Many of those directly affected, former expellees and refugees and their descendants, felt disappointed and not sufficiently recognized. This situation was, I think, mainly due to the frequent linking of the commemoration of flight and expulsion with far-reaching, sometimes radical political demands for revision and reparation, as formulated, for instance, by the speakers of the Federation of Expellees, Bund der Vertriebenen. These claims and demands were either rejected or at least not shared by large and growing sections of the political spectrum, particularly left of the center, but not only on the left. And here I would like to insert a personal note, as somebody, it was mentioned before, as somebody whose family was expelled from a small town in northern Henice, in northern Bohemia, in 1946. Many of us stayed in distance to the demands raised by expellee and refugee organizations, and in this context, in distance even to the topic, flight and expulsion, because we did not want to participate in further complicating the process of rapprochement and reconciliation with the people in the neighbor states east of us. Although we deplored expulsion as a big personal and collective loss and as an injustice, we understood it on the background of the record of hostile acts, repression, crimes, atrocities committed by Germans in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other territories of East Central Europe during the war, a record of which we were becoming increasingly aware. More than that, and in principle, in view of the massiveness and monstrosity of the Shoah and the German wars of annihilation in this part of Europe, many of us hesitated and decided against loudly deploring our losses and against articulating demands for revision and reparation in a self-assured way. After all, we had survived, unlike millions of victims of German war, persecution, and extermination. So, as you can see, memory or remembrance has been important for developing political attitudes and influencing decisions, political decisions of persons. At the same time, the public discourse on memory and remembrance has strongly been influenced by changing political situations, political moods. There has been the tendency and also the danger for historical memory to be politically instrumentalized. Its emphasis was subject to political influences and criteria. So there was increasingly or always a gap between what was publicly remembered and what was thought and said in private. And this is another reason why the aforementioned memories of flight and expulsion in the fiction literature was so important for commemoration in novels and the like can more easily evade such political instrumentalization. Small, regionally and locally focused forms of communal and private remembrance have been developed in that people only partially identify with or relate to the larger memory politics. I am in contact with the Isergebirgsmuseum, Jizara Mountains Museum, in the Bavarian town of Kaufbeuren, a museum which presents the history of a very specific and small region, including the fate of this region in 1945. It can be seen as an example of a relatively small, region-specific, highly individual, highly authentic format of remembrance, which is precisely why it enjoys widespread approval and nowadays serves as a meeting place for both German and Czech persons related to Gablonz, its region and its memory, because the first group of expellees settling in Kaufbeuren were people from Gablonz, the industries there in Neugablonz. I also want to mention that a highly respected historian, Reinhard Koselleck, who died in 2006, distanced himself from the fundamental idea of organized collective memory in one of his last essays. He emphasized that authentic remembering is ultimately always individual in nature and insisted on the right to be silent as a form of remembrance. But the turning point of 1989-91, the geopolitical restructuring in East Central Europe, and the subsequent events since then have changed the situation in the long term. The commemoration of Germans as victims, particularly of flight and expulsion at the end of World War II, became less controversial and less marginalized than it had been over the previous years. This change was helped a lot by the definite recognition of Germany's eastern borders in the process of German reunification by the Kohl government in 1990. This decision reduced the fears that still existed among Polish and Czech and other citizens, especially when living in areas not too far away from the border. In the more conservative parts of the German political spectrum, this decision of 1990 led to the, although sometimes reluctant, very reluctant, acceptance of the demarcation of borders as they had arisen as a consequence of the war, flight, and expulsion, and the decades after. Politicians and spokesmen of organizations of expellees and their descendants were, first of all, very disappointed by such basic decisions in the course of German reunification in 1990. But then, gradually, they adjusted to the new reality. They mitigated, sometimes even abandoned, far-reaching political demands that they had previously advocated, at least rhetorically. All this contributed to a relaxation of tensions. Contacts between expellees, refugees, and their descendants on the one hand, and their former homeland on the other, persons in their former homeland on the other, now became easier, in some cases even possible for the first time. And it was this kind of reconciliation which was mentioned by the ambassador in his introduction. And there was another factor which changed the situation in the same direction. In the 1990s, ethnic cleansing during the wars in the Balkans received considerable public attention and sharp rejection, indirectly in the German public, indirectly making the memory of the expulsion of Germans half a century earlier more topical. In general, media attention to victims of historical injustice in general grew worldwide. People tended to identify themselves as groups of victims. And all this was ultimately connected to a further development of the remembrance of Germans as perpetrators and of Germans as victims. Now people learned and accepted better than before that these two argumentations were not contradictory, but had not to be played off against each other and were ultimately fundamentally connected. The remembrance of Germans as perpetrators and the remembrance of Germans as victims. In 1995, in the commemorative speeches marking the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, flight and expulsion were referred to more frequently than 10 years earlier. On the one hand, there was the memory of the National Socialist dictatorship, its repression, its crimes, a memory which was further developed and firmly consolidated in unified Germany. For example, memorials were constructed or redesigned at the sites of former concentration camps like Sachsenhausen or Buchenwald. A spectacular, but I think dignified Holocaust monument, Holocaust memorial, excuse me, not monument, Holocaust memorial was erected in Berlin's historic center. Controversial and emotional debates about similarities and differences between the first and the second German dictatorship, between the National Socialist one and the Communist one in the GDR, continued to highlight the inhuman sides of Hitler's Reich. The intensive and critical dealing with the heritage of the perished GDR after 1990 did not supersede the critical memory of Nazi Germany, quite on the contrary. On the other hand, there was the memory of Germans as victims, for example, as refugees or expellees. Just one telling example. A central museum commemorating flight and expulsion had long been demanded by the Federation of Expellees and by others, but in vain. After much controversy, it came into being in Berlin in 2008 as the foundation for flight, expulsion, and reconciliation. This museum has used a broad comparative approach and did not limit itself to the German case. One of the reasons why it came into being, I think. It was based on a relatively broad consensus, including experts from different countries and various parties. It demonstrated the removal, or at least the weakening, of the taboos which had burdened and encumbered the open discussion of the topic flight and expulsion for so long. Not all differences and tensions are gone, not at all. And the topic has not anymore the mobilizing and disrupting vigor it used to have decades ago. It is less unsettling and less contested for the grandchildren of the refugees and the expellees than it had been for those who had really experienced flight and expulsion. But the topic has been included in the lively discourse about remembrance. It is not anymore marginal. Historians, for example, members of the German-Czech History Commission and of the German-Slovak Historical Commission, have contributed significantly to the development which I just summarized for you. Even the most thorough historical research cannot determine with what evaluations and with what level of commitment which experiences should be made the subject of private and public remembrance. This depends on personal and in the broadest sense, political preferences on decisions of individuals and communities. However, historians can, by drawing on their expertise, knowledge, and methods, make essential contributions. I just mentioned 3 of them. On the one hand, historians can, on the basis of sound scientific knowledge and with the help of their critical methods, criticize factual inaccuracies and over-exaggerations that are not uncommon in committed discourses on remembrance. Scientific research is an antidote to fake news, myth-making, and distorting propaganda. Secondly, the thorough consideration of connections and contexts is a central principle of historical research. Past events, experiences, actions, disasters are not only reconstructed as such by historians, but at the same time they are contextualized. They have to be contextualized by historians. They have to be understood in their historical contexts. Contextualization means taking into account the conditions and causes, as well as the consequences and side effects. With reference to German refugees and expellees, the method of historical contextualization requires and increases the willingness to see flight and expulsion as consequences of preceding experiences. The preceding war with its policies of expansion, destruction, and annihilation for which Germans were primarily responsible. Contextualization also places the German case in larger international context. So this kind of contextualization contributes not only to a more accurate and appropriate understanding of historical phenomena, but also to the gradual rapprochement between controversial positions in otherwise heated and fragmenting discussions. Contextualization helps in framing memories in an undogmatic way. Historical scholarship is calibrated to this. And third, in the ongoing tension between the need to look back, to know and remember on the one side, and the right to ignore the past and forget on the other. Historians have always to be on the latter side due to principles of their profession. In a system which grants freedom of research, historians usually, not always, argue in favor of knowledge of the past and its remembrance, including its darkest sides. By and large, this has been the case in the Federal Republic over the decades, in spite of many differences and conflicts between different historians and their schools. So, by the end of the first decade of this century, a relatively honest and comprehensive view had developed about Germans as perpetrators and Germans as victims in the Nazi dictatorship, war, and immediate post-war period. It was a highly critical, self-critical view, stressing repression, crimes, the unlimited war against Slavic people in East Central and Eastern Europe, the genocides, atrocities which took place due to German decisions and German actions under German responsibility. Commemoration of this dark side of our recent history was and continues to be painful. but it was defended as necessary and beneficial in order to do justice to the millions of victims, recognition, in order to learn from history in the sense of never again, although never again can have different meanings. And in order to mobilize energy and regain recognition for a new and a better Germany, and I mean both self-recognition and recognition by others. I would like to stress this last point. The highly self-critical view of our history was intrinsically connected with a positive view and commitment in favor of the peaceful, democratic, and increasingly liberal Germany, which has been built up in many conflicts and in spite of many counter tendencies over the decades. In this basic sense, the self-critical remembrance of the Nazi dictatorship and the culture of remembrance developed to support this view belong together and have helped to form the identity, the self-understanding, and the self-recognition of the Federal Republic of Germany, and continue to do so. Which became very clear in the recent speeches and events when the 80th anniversary of the 8th May of 1945 were recognized recently. But we live in a period of accelerated change. During the last 1 or 2 decades, change have occurred which concern and partly undermine the view of this difficult period of German history, which I have described. Let me refer to some of those changes in a very selective and very abbreviated form before ending this lecture. In Germany, like in many other countries of the world, we have experienced the rise of a new kind of right extremism, which within Germany has its center in the AfD, in the Alternative for Germany, a populist, anti-liberal, and in many ways nationalist party on the right, which attacks basic pillars of the political system, advocates deglobalization and de-Europeanization, and deeply questions the critical view of our past, which I described. AfD speakers have demanded a 180-degree reversal of the course of our historical culture. They want to see the self-critical interpretation of German recent history as a denial of German greatness, and which was, according to their interpretation, forced upon us by the Allied victors of 1945. They try to play down the importance of the Nazi dictatorship and describe it as a minimal and excusable aberration, as a piece of Vogelschiss, bird's funk, as one of their leaders said, as unimportant and without relevance compared to the many achievements and successes, the great deeds within the course of 1,000 or 2,000 years of German history. They offer an increasingly influential platform for voices questioning the sober and self-critical interpretation of German history in the first half of the 20th century. Voices like that have always existed, but now they have become more numerous and more influential in our political culture, particularly during the last decade. The widespread attack on liberal democratic principles questions basics of the critical view of our history, which I described. This is related to basic changes in world politics, and it's interesting to see how much cooperation, or at least proximity, seems to exist between leaders of the AfD on the one hand, and both the ruling group in Moscow around Putin on the one hand, and now to Trump and some of his collaborators like Vance and Musk on the other. So there is a relationship between these domestic changes, which exist in the many countries right now, this rise of right-wing extremism on the one hand, and changes in world politics. The return of war to Europe with the Russian attack on the Ukraine on the one hand, Trumpism in the United States have shattered and are shattering the liberal optimism and the trust in Western-style liberal democracy, which in a way has been central to our interpretations of the earlier periods of modern German history. The ugly war between Israel and Palestinians, some Palestinians in Gaza, has accelerated the rise of anti-Semitism, which was rising anyway and is rising anyway. And of course, the rejection of and fight against anti-Semitism has been and continues to be a central element of the historical interpretation of the Nazi period, which I summarized for you. Inside academia, particularly on the left, post-colonialism theories and debates have gained much influence. Along this line, questions are raised and theses are formulated, which also challenge the historical interpretation and remembrance culture which I have described. Was not European colonialism over the centuries much more problematic, inhuman, destructive than the dictatorships, wars, and genocides inside 20th century Europe? Is the German preoccupation with their tradition of guilt and shame not just or mainly a way of diverting self-critical energy from those century-old crimes of colonizing Europe, of Europe when colonizing the world? And of course, there is the changing structure of the German population. Zeitzeugen, contemporary witnesses who could testify and did testify about these catastrophic developments in schools, in the public, in newspapers, in TV, who could do this because they had been part of it and had experienced them, have become rare. They are dying. Actually, Margot Friedländer, a person, a woman, age 103, who has played a major public role in our country over the last years as somebody who testified about her experiences being repressed as a Jewish child, has just died. And with a lot of attention by the political leaders and the media, a big event, with a lot of sympathy and admiration, they die. So commemoration becomes more abstract, less concrete, more institutionalized, more routinized. And for the younger generation, the distance has grown and is growing between their life and the world in which Hitler, World War II, and the Holocaust took place. This is a big problem, and I don't take the time now to speak about this, changing attitudes, diminished knowledge in young generations about these issues. And the proportion of German citizens with migration background grows. Their feeling of responsibility for earlier crimes of an older generation of indigenous Germans must be different in some way or the other. I come to the end. The critical view of the Nazi dictatorship continues to be lively and strong in present-day Germany. It is the most central element in the dominant interpretations of 20th century German history. And it is dominant in the public remembrance culture. With respect to important details, it may be changing. I'm not going to this now. But the critical view of the Nazi period as important and formative influences the policies of the Federal Republic of Germany in many ways, both foreign policy and the stress on liberal democratic principles to be defended against attacks. Wehrhafte Demokratie is the German word. Public opinion surveys show that popular interest in this part of our history declines only slowly. But the number of those who are skeptical about the intensity of remembrance culture grows. Anyway, it's an important factor and a basic element of the liberal democratic structure and culture of West Germany, of Germany. But the constellation is becoming more fluid. Changes are on the way. And as usual, historians are better in describing and explaining the past than in predicting the future. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kocka, for sharing your current reflection of this long German quest for finding balance between humble acceptance of one's crimes and awareness of being a victim and forgetting, between this boom of remembrance and political instrumentalization of memory and all that. I especially like the moment in which you put personal testimony and this good old historical contextualization against this current, digital boom of memory, which is clippy and quickly remembers and quickly forgets. That was very valuable, and thanks for that. But there are another 100 people in this room and 50 more people online who have probably always thought about what it would be like to get into a Gespräch, if not Streit, with you. So there is sometimes time left for a few questions, and I open the floor. We will need to use the microphone. I should also make you aware of that this whole session is being recorded, and it would be lovely if you could say your name or institution before your comment.
Michal Pullman, Charles University Prague. Thank you very much for very inspiring presentation. I totally agree that this self-critical view of the past is very important for mobilizing energy, for I mean both recognition and self-recognition. My question would be, who are the agents who can test this? I mean, you were talking about the AfD in Germany, but it's not only the case of Germany. I mean that there are quite broad groupings who challenge any kind of self-critical view, and who vote for more patriotic and more positive view of their particular history. I always appreciated from the very Klassengesellschaft im Krieg through the white collars to your analysis of labor, etc. You were always very sensitive towards the class-specific features, towards the agents. Who are these agents? What are they needs to challenge this self-critical view from your perspective, from the German perspective? But it's more general problem.
Understood you correctly. Who are this question? Who were agents and who are agents on both sides, if I may say so? It's a social historical question I should not have left out. Well, you know, in the beginning, political leaders were very important. Adenauer understood that an agreement with Ben-Gurion, leader on the Israeli side, would help on the way of recognition of West Germany on the international scene. And some considerations like that were important in first steps towards accepting publicly German guilt at that time and responsibility. And I mean, this sobering observation has continued to be effective in the whole process. The churches played a role early on. And again, and then academics, students, Bildungsbürger played a role in asking for more honesty and openness and self-reflection in the 60s and 70s. The group of agents broadened, became less specific, and details, and we have strong regional differences between East and West Germany nowadays. If you ask for those who challenge these views, these critical views of self, with respect to our past, again, regional differences are very pronounced. Those with lower education are more prone to reject the self-critical view. Education makes a big difference. And in this context, also socioeconomic status. And again, the division of Germany in two parts for 40 years continues to play a role. As you may know, that the AfD is much more accepted in Saxony and other East German states than in the West, although in the last elections, it also made progress in the West. But it's a complicated issue of which I would have to know more details in order to give a better answer to your question.
I'm Gabriel Silagi. I was working at the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, and I'm living here from Prague for 30 years, commuting to Munich. And now, when you gave this description of the developments, I think you did it from your Berlin standpoint, missing what happened in Bavaria until the 2010 about. When I married, my wife came with me in 1995, 96, and she was terrified about the atmosphere there. The most known German politician in Bavaria was not Kohl, but Neubauer, the head of the Sudetendeutsche Mannschaft. And even in 2002, the Sudetendeutsche made an exposition in the Munich University Library about the Munich Treaty, but it was not called Münchner Abkommen, but Grenzbereinigungsabkommen mit der Czechoslovakia, showing that all the parts that have been brought to Germany were German-speaking and belonged, of course, to the Reich. And what everyone seems to forget is that the CSU, at the voting for the entrance of the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia then, was the only group voting against the entrance of the Republic. And one of them was Mr. Posselt, who now plays a great role as a great friend of the Czechoslovakia. So Germany is not Germany alone, and the development was a little bit retarded in places. The Theodor Schieder, whom you mentioned, was afterwards found out that in 1939 he had already written a statement before the war broke out, what the Reich should do with the new Polish government after the Entjudung. That's what he wrote, Theodor Schieder. Afterwards, they didn't make some Theodor Schieder Gedächtnisvorlesung anymore, but until then, he was the greatest of historians.
Thank you very much. You remind us of the burdens in the biographies of major historians. Theodor Schieder, but also Werner Conze had a tradition as Volkshistoriker and with certain proximity to National Socialist positions before World War II, in World War II, and became important, leading, pioneering historians in the Federal Republic of Germany. And it is one of the most interesting aspects to study for a historian, how this change has occurred. Most recently, those of you who follow German things, most recently, the left-oriented publisher of the Surkamp publishing company, who died some years ago, it was discovered that he had been a member of the National Socialist Party, and he had never mentioned this. And such discoveries still make for a scandal in our media, and we discuss that a lot. This is discussed a lot, and this change, sometimes under problematic conditions and in a hidden way, from active participation in the dictatorial regime before 1940 and into an active commitment for the new Germany, and rather even on the left, is an interesting development. First part, this relates to your last remark. Yes, I mean, there's many Sudeten Germans ended up in Bavaria. Bavaria welcomed them more than other parts of Germany. They even sometimes called the Sudeten Germans der vierte Stamm der Bayern, the fourth tribe of Bavaria. And my example, Kaufbeuren, the Isargebirgsmuseum, again, that's Bavaria. And regional differences of importance. But the apostle, the person you mentioned, who as a politician of the CSU voted against the entrance of the Czech Republic into the EU, has now become different persons. I know him from discussions. He is much more oriented towards cooperation, towards close contacts between Germans and Czechs. And he's working for that. And this is equally true for his brother, another apostle who has been journalist and now edits journals in this area. So this is what I want to stress, that changes occurred between hardline positions represented before 1990 and slow changes towards more conciliatory, towards more accepting positions later. But you are right, Bavaria would be the place to study this.
Michal Kopeček, Institute of Contemporary History. Thank you, Professor Kocka, for a very interesting lecture. I would have two short questions, but big implications, both of them. First is, you did not mention the Vergangenheitsbewältigung concerning the second German dictatorship, and I would like to ask you how you see, the SED-Diktatur, how you see its role in the whole process that you were describing, especially since actually not only 1990s, actually already before also the old Federal Republic. And what I mean is, do you see it as a part and parcel of this West German critical historical dealing with the past, and what role does it play? Or is it actually something that remained in this big societal processes on the margin? And if it's so, despite all the resources that have been invested into the Forschung and public work, why is it so? Is it because of the weight of Holocaust? Is it because of how the German historical culture has developed? So this is one question. And the second question is, you mentioned, interestingly, and I find this was a very interesting part of your lecture, the silences, right? And how important they are. Now, I would like to ask about the other side of the coin, and that is provocative parlances, right? And provocative parlances like Holocaust denial. How do you assess actually the German story? Can you weave it into your story, this kind of freedom of speech versus Holocaust denial, kind of paradox of public discourse? Or how do you assess actually the democracy versus collective remembrance balance sheet of West German historical culture? Thank you.
This role of the GDR was in the center of your first question. A big topic. I mean, controversial debates on similarities and differences between these two dictatorships after 1990, which cannot be reconstructed now by me. In the period until 1990, in the period of the Cold War, the existence of a communist state and society east of the Federal Republic played a role in the West Germany's attempts to situate itself in the world and in the world of ideas. And in a way, the rejection of the SED dictatorship in East Germany was frequently part of hiding and ignoring the dictatorial past and origins of the Federal Republic of Germany. And activists and journalists and intellectuals in East Germany were active in discovering and exposing as the National Socialistic roots and burdens of the biographies of leading West Germans. So they contributed to the controversial attempts to develop a more accurate and more honest relationship in the West. But this was rejected as communist propaganda. So it's hard to define it under one idea, this complicated interaction between West Germany and East Germany on the ways of hiding and exposing the dictatorial past of West Germany. After 1990, public debates helped to define the character of the East German state and society, and I leave this aside for the moment. But it also helped to highlight the brutal and inhumane aspects of the Third Reich, which had no parallel in the East German dictatorship. So some of us were afraid that after 1990, the talk about the East German dictatorship would relativize our decided criticism against the Nazi period, but the opposite was true. This debate helped to keep alive and even increase the critical comments against the National Socialist past. That was the first question. Yeah. What was the second? I think I should have made more, I should have differentiated more zwischen, the German words are Erinnerung and Gedenken. Memory as a process done by individuals and also refused by individuals with legitimation. Gedenken, remembrance, practiced in the public with a symbolic function, with social and political functions. We should distinguish this more than I have done so. And I would say, with respect to memory, in the first sense, liberal structures are decisive more than democratic ones. With respect to remembrance as a political public endeavor, democracy comes in because it's influenced, and it influences this kind of actions. So it's complicated, and certainly, as we know, liberal and democratic is not the same.
Michal Frankl, Czech Academy of Sciences and the GWZO. So in your lecture, you have positioned these two lines of memory, the National Socialism and the Holocaust on the one hand, and flight and expulsion against each other. And then you discuss the reluctant coming closer in the 90s of these two traditions. And because both of them are related to refugee experience and to migration, I was wondering how the current shift in research towards migration studies and the interest in memory studies for migration. So there's a lot of interest in memory and archives of migration. How does that change this situation and this kind of competition between these two memories? Also given, so on the one hand, this is an opportunity to bring them together under a more neutral umbrella of migration research. On the other hand, it's a highly polarized topic, publicly, politically, and I think also in the scientific community. So was this shift towards migration research and memory means for the story that you told us?
I'm not sure how to answer this question, but I would like to highlight one point. I have worked a lot in a society of friends of the Sachsenhausen memorial place, reminding us of the concentration camp near Berlin. And I know that the question how to get contact with and access to communities of immigrants was a major concern for the leadership of this memorial place. And the major impression was that it was difficult to get African people of Turkish or Arabic migration background involved. And one of the questions, again, I think the ambassador touched upon this problem already. To what extent can new arrivals identify with the concerns, with the anxieties, and the satisfaction of Germans who have lived in this country for a long time and who themselves or over their families, their parents or grandparents were part of the catastrophic developments. I'm not sure how this question can be answered in general. It's relatively clear that the rise of anti-Semitism in recent years in Germany has several roots, but one of the roots is the arrival of migrants from the Arabic countries, where the rejection of Jewish life and religion is a central element of belief. However, there are Arabic intellectuals and public persons who speak out in the public with an Arabic, or in this case, Egyptian background, who strongly strongly support the liberal card and try to convince their fellows to become critical of certain forms of anti-liberal rejections. This is the problem. This is a problem, and the increasing ethnic heterogeneity of the German citizenship is one of the basic changes with which the strategies of keeping memories alive have to handle.
Thank you. I think time is up. So I would like to thank you all for staying here with us, being here, being online with us. Thank the two of you for making this possible. And our special thanks go to Professor Kocka. Thank you. This was a major pleasure.